And tonight we are very happy to have Aidan Ricketts, and he is a lecturer in the Law and Justice Department at Southern Cross University. He's an author, and he's really quite a profound activist. And he's worked with a passionate commitment in Australia to work for the environment, including Bentley. I believe you helped a lot with Bentley. That deserves a round of applause. And really he's worked tirelessly to coordinate all sorts of non-violent protests against CSG, but also against mining, deforestation, probably fracking. Oh, I didn't read that in your... And he's worked here and in Vanuatu. So he's also concerned that conspiracy theories distract us from the true causes of the impoverishment of society and the environment. And operating in plain sight, we have the corporate, military, and financial agendas replacing democracy and sustainability right under our own eyes. So I think that's a really fascinating and already got me quite stimulated and excited topic. And so we named it Conspiracy or Sociopathic Corporations. Let's have a warm welcome for Aidan Ricketts.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's easy to get a packed house during COVID. Everybody says, oh, it's packed out already. Because there's only a quarter of us here. Okay. Can't even see that. It was upside down and never noticed. All right, so yeah, certainly this, just about everything we're sort of experiencing seems to be influenced either by Trump or COVID or both at the moment. And particularly, yeah, one of the things I'm sort of interested in talking about, and for those who read my blogs in the Nimbin Good Times, I've been giving it a good bash there month after month. You know, really trying to keep people focused on, you know, what the real problems are that are really facing us, and not to get distracted on fanciful ones. But I think, you know, one of the things that frustrates me the most in trying to have conversations with people about conspiracy theories and, you know, the real problems that we face in the world is kind of the false dichotomies that get set up so quickly. False dichotomies and binaries have always upset me because I'm kind of a complexity thinker, so I always see things as being sort of multifaceted. But, you know, it's natural for humans to think in either or and right, wrong and yes, no terms. Our entire language reflects it, and it might be because we sort of have a left arm and a right arm, really, but we do tend to think of things that way. But it rarely ever reflects reality very well. And, you know, one of the things that's very frustrating is, you know, as people have sort of divided, particularly over COVID, it's been one of the biggest, you know, and this is one of the things I want to explore, you know, what are the divides socially that COVID has sort of revealed. And, you know, one of the things that's frustrated me in these conversations is that people will start, you know, carrying on with, you know, wild conspiracy theories that, you know, all the doctors and immunologists and scientists are all agreeing to lie to us and so on, and you'll sort of question that and they'll go, oh, so you believe everything you're told, do you? And it's just like, no, I don't believe everything I'm told. You know, I've been a, you know, left-wing activist for years, totally critical of the status quo, totally critical of the corporations, totally critical of big pharma, as you are, you know, totally critical of big corporate agribusiness, critical of the military establishment, and still critical of those things. But what worries me is stopping being critical of those things and, you know, and you know, okay, I'll caricature a bit, which is a form of straw manning, but you know, to take it to its extreme, stopping looking at those real threats and starting to believe that all of Donald Trump's opponents are sort of baby-eating pedophiles. You know, it's like, it's just not believable, it's just not useful, but it's a massive distraction from what's really going on. So, you know, so I think we do need to be free thinkers, we do need to be critical thinkers, we do need to be sceptical with, you know, the way we receive and process information in the digital age. But, you know, we don't become that by rejecting science, rejecting mainstream journalism, rejecting you know, most empiric evidence, and then accepting wholesale a few YouTube videos sort of describing the way the world is. So that's, you know, the thing that sort of really motivated me, is to try and find a middle way through all of that, to go, because I've seen colleagues sort of do that. They've become sort of so anti-conspiracy theory that it sounds like they're saying don't question things, everything you're being told is true. And that's sort of just falling into the dichotomous trap that conspiracies are sort of setting up. Now, you know, we can go, and I'm not going to look at conspiracies for too long, but we can, you know, I think we can agree that the underlying anxieties that drive conspiracy theory are real. And I think that's one of the things we need to concede to people when we're talking to them about these things is, you know, yes, yes, our liberties are disappearing. Yes, there's rising fascism around the world. Yes, we are being manipulated by dark forces. Yes, vested interests are corrupting our governments. Yes, we're being lied to. Yes, we've lost faith in governments. You know, all those things are real. So I think, you know, good, rational, left-thinking people, as well as conspiracists, are all responding to the same feelings, the same emotional reality, the same bewilderment of the world, but the question is what we do with that. And so that's what I'm sort of looking at. I had some speaking notes here, but I just really can't see them, so I'm just going to free range it. No. So what it really gets me back to is to try to look at what the things that have brought the world to, and I use the term the dismal tide. You know, what we've been experiencing in the last 30 years is this dismal tide, where we see you know, government being dismantled, you know, health expenditure being dismantled, education expenditure being dismantled, the dismantling of science, really, the dismantling not just of the respect of science, but dismantling of things like research, development, land management agencies, all those kinds of things. You know, we just, you know, national parks is routinely like underfunded, budget after budget after budget, until they can barely do anything. We've seen the CSIRO dismantled. You know, just to use Australian examples. It's this terrible dismal tide, and, you know, we've been fed this idea that government is too expensive, and that the other thing that is way too expensive is fairness. So where did we get these ideas from? And what I'd like to take us back to, really, is to start thinking again about corporations. And again, another one of the big distractions, it's not, conspiracy theories are one form of distraction from the real problems we face, but another one is we're humans. We tend to be anthropocentric, we tend to be, so we think in human terms. And when we try to think of a demon or a villain, we also want to think of a human. So I've always noticed we have this incredible tendency to focus on the human demons. So we will focus on the Rupert Murdochs and the Rupert Murdochs, Elon Musk, you know, Bill Gates and Bezos and whoever else, you know, the billionaires, the rich humans. But what tends to escape that is the big multinational corporations. And they have been a building presence in our societies globally for decades and decades and decades. I mean, in fact, since the 1850s, but it's really probably from about World War I, and certainly it's just been an accelerating corporatisation, particularly after World War I into World War II, and then World War II was great for the corporations. I mean, you know, if you couldn't sell Coke in Nazi Germany, you just sold Fanta instead. And then after the war, you know, post-war reconstruction, it just went ballistic. And we have to really start to understand what corporations are, and it's something I've studied a lot over the years. They're an early form of artificial intelligence, you know. Well, they are, from the 1850s. They were set up effectively to replicate how male liberalist thinkers thought of humans in the mid-19th century. And, you know, sort of white male thinkers in the mid-19th century had this obsession that humans were little more than sort of self-serving, individualistic and acquisitive beings. So that the whole point of being human really was just being individualistic, serving yourself and accumulating wealth. So they're established as a sort of a Frankenstein, established in their image, in the same way of God creating humans in God's image. It was like all humans created corporations, not in the image of what humans really are, but in the image of what sort of white male liberalists in the mid-19th century imagined humans were, which is these, basically selfish, individualist and acquisitive, materially acquisitive beings. So we set these things up as a form of artificial intelligence. We gave them all of the legal rights, slowly over time, all of the legal rights of humans, and yet they're not humans in very, very significant ways. They're not humans. We can list a few of those ways. They don't breathe air, okay? They don't drink water, so they don't have those basic vulnerabilities. You cannot imprison them because they do not have bodies. Because they don't have bodies, they don't have anybody they're related to. They don't have any emotional bonds to anybody else. They never, see a child be born or have a father die. They are just artificial intelligence. They are just these entities. But they have been these sort of de facto humans within our legal system, within our economic system, that have begun to drive our system as they got bigger and bigger and bigger. So that relentless logic, in a way, of 19th century liberalism has sort of been turned into permanent form and allowed to just enlarge and enlarge and enlarge until it dominates our economy, dominates our legal systems, and effectively becomes dominant governance institutions within our society. And again, going back to that 19th century liberalism, liberals were so worried that government, that they sort of, again, dichotomies again. They had the dichotomy of the individual and the government. They were terrified the government was this big scary collective that was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and oppress the individual. And your right-wing libertarians are still obsessed with that fear. But what they never sort of understood was that corporations are also governance institutions which are collective, which are also impersonal and capable of growing and growing and growing and taking over your society and oppressing not just individuals but the whole of nature in their relentless pursuit of profit. So somehow they escaped notice. They escaped notice by liberalism, they escaped notice, and they escape notice from people to this day. We keep, as bad as Murdoch is, as bad as, who's as bad as Murdoch? Nobody. Okay, as bad as Murdoch is, it's these huge empires that get created. We find it harder to think about the Halliburtons, who are doing every bit as much damage as Burton on a day-to-day basis. The Westinghouses and the massive corporations. And these corporations grew and grew and grew to become bigger than most governments. I'm no good with figures, so I can't really, if I had a piece of paper I could quote figures, but they're bigger than most governments on the planet, many of the top 100 corporations. And so this is that big invisible, brooding, frightening presence, I believe, that people feel sort of, that feels like a conspiracy, that feels like there's some shadowy elite that's running the world and we don't know who they are and things aren't really as they seem. And it's true, that's exactly true, because corporations even don't really have to get together and decide to manipulate things for their own purposes, like a little elite cabal. It's in their very nature, it's in their very structure to do that. In fact, a company director is in breach of their duties if they don't act in the interests of that corporation and maximise its wealth. So it's absolutely intrinsic. So if we start to imagine them really as a form of artificial intelligence, as a form of governance institution that, instead of replicating perhaps some of the best aspects of humans, that actually replicates the worst aspects of humans, the individualism, the competitiveness, the acquisitiveness, and effectively sociopathic. Because the one thing that corporations do not have is a moral faculty. So you can't even say that they're evil as such, because to be properly evil, you've got to have a moral faculty. So they're not even evil, they're just relentlessly self-interested, and they will follow that self-interest to the death of the very planet and to the destruction of our societies. So that's what corporations are. So that's what's going on in the background all the time. But then tracing back, and again, I'm just trying to trace, where this dismal tide, that we're now living at the arse end of this dismal tide, where this dismal tide came from. So we have democracies. Now, like you said, Vincent, democracy, that may not be the best thing, but it's sort of the best thing we've been able to come up with, because it does have some checks and balances, which, at least from an anthropocentric perspective, kind of, bring grievances to the surface and allow things to be changed. It's a little bit more difficult for the environment, because anthropocentrism is just so innate to 90% of humans, from what I can see. Anyway, that's another topic. And by about the 1970s, for societies like Australia and equivalent societies, we'd sort of reached a high point of social democracy, really, where we had an underlying capitalist model, we had growing corporate power, but we also had balanced that to a large extent, and the Whitlam government was the classic example of this, balanced that to a large extent with some social democracy. So we had high expenditure on education and even free university, then high expenditure on healthcare and on scientific research and so on. And then what we got from 1980 onwards was the dawn of neoliberalism. And make no mistake, Reagan and Thatcher and the dawn of neoliberalism was the creation of corporate think tanks to go, well, we don't really like this social democracy, we don't really like this democratic socialist amelioration of capitalism, it doesn't suit us, let's create think tanks, let's create a political philosophy that suits us. And that's effectively how we got neoliberalism. And we've had neoliberalism continuously, really, since the early 1980s. And so strongly that even, for example, the Labor Party sort of, has more or less fallen in step with it, even though most members are probably, personally slightly uncomfortable with it. And that's what's produced our dismal tide. It's a terrible absurdity when you think about it, but we've been, not us perhaps, but the country keeps on electing people to government that don't really believe in government. For all their talk of small government, they don't really believe in governing, and so what they do is they constantly dismantle it. I mean, I despair every time there's another tax cut, because that's just part of that race to the bottom of neoliberalism, in which you go, well, we're going to get you all to vote for us because we're going to tell you you're going to get a tax cut, and then the government's going to have less money next time around, and we're going to say, oh dear, look, we've got less tax income, now we've got to cut health expenditure, now we've got to cut education expenditure, now we've got to cut environmental programs. But we don't have to cut the military, of course. So that just happens in round after round after round. And for anybody who even could bear to open their eyes and look at the budget last night, you just saw it, in its worst place. I mean, and where we've got to now with the Morrison government, I mean, not only do they not believe in government or governance, they were elected without policies, not even expecting to win. And so, we don't even have the appearance of, you look back on Tony Abbott or John Howard, and it was like, well, they seem to even believe in something, as wrong and as right-wing and as conservative as it was, they actually had a belief in something as a human, and now we just seem to have this sort of puppet government, and when you stripped away all of it, there's sort of nothing left but the corruption. And so what are we doing? It's just a government, a kleptocracy that's just basically raiding the public piggy bank and handing it hand over fist to Rupert Murdoch, to the fossil fuel industry, just handing it over and calling it, a COVID-led recovery. So that's the dismal tide we're in. We don't need to think that Joe Biden eats children or keeps them in bunkers under the ground or puts them on pizzas or whatever it is we're supposed to believe in order to realise that this is what's sort of going on around us. But it's also intellectually difficult. We're asking people to imagine that, things like corporations. These are the big, creepy, not secret, and this is the thing, they're not actually secret, they're right in our face, but they're hard to see. It's much easier for us to look at billionaires and millionaires. I'm a lot less scared of Bill Gates than I am of Halliburton, and that's for certain. So that's the sort of, the dismal tide we're harvesting now, and that's the sort of, I sort of worry a bit about this turning points thing, because I've got to confess, I'm not feeling particularly optimistic at the moment. I'm going, there's turning points happening, all right. They're happening all around us. I mean, there's climate change tipping points. There's a tipping point into rising fascism that seems to be happening right in front of our eyes in America. So it's very alarming, very, very frightening at the moment, the tipping points that we are facing. And of course, we want to be optimistic. Of course, we want to look at what we can do about that. But I think at this point in time, one of the things that I've found, even in my own work, is stepping back a little bit from even thinking that we've got any grand solutions and going, for fuck's sake, the first thing we need to do at the moment is stay a little bit sane. Because that seems to be one of the biggest challenges at the moment, is having any sense of what's going on in the world and where it's heading. And certainly it's unpredictable. But, you know, we can cope with unpredictability and stay sane. And the question is how to do that. So what I want to sort of get through to really is the personal, the personal aspects of how we respond to this dismal tide, how we respond, you know, to the sheer horror of Trump and the rising fascism, not just in America, the fascism we're seeing in Brazil, you know, Brazil, Turkey, Philippines, Russia, China, it's all around us. And I mean, it certainly frightens me. I mean, American democracy is really having its last sort of fight out with that fascism. And not, you know, I don't want to go into predicting what's going to happen, but if America goes fully fascist, the pressure is going to be on Australia to fall into line. And we've got Peter Dutton sitting there just waiting to be elevated when the time comes to institute fascism here. So, you know, it's dismal. We're in a big fight with fascism, and it's sad that, you know, it's sad that the frustration, the disappointment, the distrust in government that people have, the falling living standards that people are experiencing are all actually the result of neoliberalism. But instead of seeing it for what it is and responding to that and changing that, they just sort of fall in this other direction and go, oh, you know, it's, you know, they go in any other direction. You know, they end up voting for a fascist, a populist fascist, to make America great again, when it's like, well, don't you realise what tore America apart? It was actually the neoliberalism in the first place, and then you're just going for more of that. So a theme of this, for me, because I like looking at, you know, things in terms of complexity theory, is if we can start looking to our political responses as whether they're adaptive or maladaptive, because there's two absolutely classic maladaptive responses at the moment. And the first one I've talked about already, which is going into conspiracism. I'm sort of going, look, I can see, I don't trust the government, and I don't trust the media, and I'm being blasted with information from social media, so I don't know what to believe anymore, and now I'm just going to randomly choose to believe a whole lot of things for whatever reason, which predisposes people to getting sucked in to agendas, sucked into conspiracy theories. And the frightening thing is a lot of the conspiracy theories are, as we know, are now being deliberately generated by right-wing think tanks like QAnon to actually shunt people from, you know, from ethical positions towards blatant right-wing support. So that's one maladaptive response, is to sort of give up on reason, give up on the evidence, give up on really trying to discern what's going on, and just get carried along in alternative explanations. The other maladaptive response is conservatism. Conservatism is inherently and is always a maladaptive response. So when your society is facing some sort of decline, and look, you know, it's fine that the West is declining in world power, that always needed to happen. But, you know, in the face of falling living standards, in the face of all of these things, conservatism is that idea that if we somehow try to run backwards to the past, we'll prevent this decline. But any understanding of the way systems work tells you that systems become resilient and systems survive by adapting. Systems do not survive by getting scared of change and going backwards. So change is a constant, change is there to be adapted to, that's what resilience is. Conservatism, always, at any point in history, conservatism is maladaptive. And conservatism is the response we're getting. And one of the things that, sadly, is fueling conservatism as a maladaptive response also is the outrage of lost privilege. So as, you know, America loses its position, or white people start losing their position, or men start losing their position of privilege, there is this tendency to go, well, I don't like this change. Instead of adapting to it, I want to rush backwards to a prior state. You can't rush backwards to a prior state. If you do, I mean, just think about it. If you could even get back to a prior state, you'd only go back to the preconditions that had led to the thing you were running away from. So necessarily, conservatism delays adaptation and promotes abrupt collapse. And we've been doing that for a very long time. So we've had neoliberalism, conservatism. So we are necessarily pushing towards abrupt collapse, you know, of our social and economic systems. You know, which is sort of great. We always wanted capitalism to collapse, but it's kind of capitalism and everything else around it's collapsing. The climate's collapsing, the society's collapsing, you know, democracy's collapsing. So it's sort of, you know, it's not quite as simple as just having capitalism collapse for us while we still go on with farming in a decent climate and a bit of social democracy. That would have been lovely, but it hasn't turned out that way. And I really see fascism, I just use the term conservatism is a maladaptive response, and I just use the term conservatism, and it's more violent brother fascism. Because fascism really, just to me, is the more violent brother of conservatism. It's just enforced conservatism. It's just the enforced attempt to go back to a previous state of privilege, the enforced attempt to go back to a previous state in history. And they may not be states in history that ever existed, you know. They may be absolute fanciful projections of you know, populist leaders, but you know, that make America great sort of nonsense is exactly that kind of thing. And you know, it looks like conservatism, and then suddenly it's fascism. But the thing it might not surprise us so much that conservatism can lead to fascism. What's probably concerned us much more in the Northern Rivers is how being hippies can lead to fascism. And that's been a lot more frightening. I mean, personally, I've always seen some of the potentially fascist and Puritan kind of tendencies in some of the New Age movement. The one that scared me the most, you know, was that some iridologists thought that naturally humans had blue eyes, and if they had brown eyes, it was toxin. And I sort of went, right, so 90% of the ethnicities on this planet are toxic, except the wonderful blue-eyed ones. That's an extreme example, but you know, I've actually sort of read that from some, not all iridologists, mind you, don't want to upset anyone. But yeah, but you know, even New Age ideas of karma can often be these ideas of, you know, well, I get my privilege because I deserve it, and people who are disabled or suffering or poor or whatever else, it's, you know, because of their past crimes and, you know, or the way they live, or that they're just not manifesting as much privilege as I've managed to manifest. So, you know, that stuff's been there all along. It hasn't been a problem, but it's suddenly becoming a problem because it's being easily co-opted by QAnon and these various conspiracy theories. So I was sort of, and this I think gets us to the other big question about what's the other great big divide that COVID has really revealed for us, and particularly for those of us who see ourselves as being on the left. You know, because we had sort of always assumed, you know, hippies, greenies, leftists, all sort of a big broad family, and then suddenly we're seeing some being shunted away into an extreme right position. And I think that's been really something I've thought about a lot and really looked at, and I think what the pandemic's really done for us is made this division not along the lines of who's left-wing and who's right-wing in the traditional ways we think about it, but who's communitarian and who's individualist. And that's maybe something we weren't thinking about a whole lot before. And that's what particularly in the Northern Rivers context, that's what I'm starting to see around us all of a sudden, is that we all thought we were sort of on the same boat, but some people were in it for purely individualist reasons. I want to live a good life where I'm surrounded by nature and I'm healthy and I eat good food and my children are healthy and educated in a lovely school. And I used to have a friend who said, oh yeah, we call those selfies of photos now, but oh, those people aren't greenies, they're selfies. I had a friend telling me this for years, and I went, but that's become obvious. Whereas the other people saying, no, I'm here to save the planet, not just me. I'm here to have a fair society, not just me. I'm worried about my community, not just me. I'm worried about agriculture, not just me. We are the communitarians. And this has become the big change. And see, one of the things you saw as the pandemic came on is long before the governments, for example, were saying, hey, we need to have some social distancing and put masks on and so on, the communitarian left were already doing it. Some of the anarchist left, the communitarian left and so on in the big cities were already pushing for it, and it was the governments who were not prepared to do it because they knew it would affect business. Later, the governments realised it was such a big thing, they got on board and did it. And who has really kicked back against it is individualists. So whether that's your kind of pure, right-wing, gun-toting Republican individualist in the States, or whether it's your sort of Bunnings Karens or your sort of sovereign citizens, nobody tells me what to do because I'm sovereign all in myself, it's always about the individualism rather than the communitarianism. And I think this is a really important lesson for us to all learn, because as we go forward, this is going to be the divide increasingly. And and I'll say it now, when I sit on a polling booth, out in some, one of our regional towns, and sit there, say, with the people from the National Party, I'll often, talk to them and find, look, the values of these people who are sitting there with them, they're quite communitarian. The values of the National Party voter and the Greens voter can be very, very similar. I want our region to be looked after, I care about our communities, I want good infrastructure and services here. We just come to different conclusions. We think, well, therefore I want the Greens, and they think, therefore I want the National Party. I'm not talking about proper Tories here. They are individualistic. And so that's what you're kind of seeing with this communitarian individualist divide, is individualists, it's not just a right-wing, left-wing thing. There's kind of right-wing communitarians and left-wing communitarians, and there's right-wing libertarians and left-wing individualists. Strange. Well, they're not really left-wing, because you can't really be a left-wing hyper-individualist. And it's not to say that all individualism is a bad thing. Obviously, it's part of the spectrum of our life, and we have to look after it. But it's this hyper-individualism which has become, the real problem. So, where did we get this hyper-individualism from? And this is where I cycle right back and go back to corporations. When we, in the 1850s, set up these institutions which reflected an extremely narrow conception of what it is to be human, when we took it from those, white, male, privileged, liberal philosophers of the mid-19th century who said, oh yes, humans, all humans, are just self-interested and acquisitive. So we set up corporations to be like that. Then those corporations have taken over and become the dominant social and economic, particularly economic governance institutions of our time. And so they've created a world built around selfishness and acquisitiveness. So that's necessarily sort of created and then been doubly reinforced by neoliberal politics to just go, well, everything has to be a commodity, everything has to have a value, everything has to be tradable, and so on. So let's just go on a little exercise for a moment and say, well, let's just get into the mind of corporations. Let's look back at humans from the corporate mind. And it's very interesting. I mean, we get used to these terms like human resources. That's very, very telling. How come we got called human resources rather than staff? Because like coal and steel and water, we're just a resource. You just plug us in at one end of the economic thing, you shake it all up, and you spit something out at the end, cream off some profits, and there's somebody who dies a week after they retire. Well-used human resource. So that sort of terminology really makes you realise. So I've sort of got one way of looking at it, saying if you looked at globally, if you looked at humans from the perspective of corporations, there's about 4 different kinds as far as humans are concerned. There's managers, who are sort of, the co-opted lizard people who do the work of the corporations. There's workers who work in the factories, and there's consumers who need to be given enough money to be able to consume again. And hey, look at what we're doing. We're lowering interest rates, we're encouraging people to go into debt to save capitalism. The government just collapsed the banking rules again so everybody can get more debt. Going into negative interest rates for the first time in history. We're looking at this idea of, we'll go to negative interest rates. We don't know whether this will work, but we just want you all in debt, please. Why do we want you all in debt? So that you keep buying things, so that you keep being consumers, and so that you personally underwrite late capitalism and the fall of capitalism. So when and as it falls, you are the guys who are paying it off with the debts that you're in. So managers, workers, consumers. What's the 4th type of human? Superfluous. Just superfluous. The unemployed, the people in, people in much of the third world and developing world. If you don't have a use for the corporations, you're just superfluous humans. Now, how did we see this actually happen? Look at the AIDS drug scenario that happened years ago. When penicillin was discovered, real scientists funded by public money in social democracies found penicillin and went, look at this life-saving drug, let's get it out to the world as fast as possible. But by the time we got through to the 1980s and the 1990s, that corporatisation of the world had already taken place. That sociopathic view of things had already taken place. So the thinking of corporations was, so we come up with a drug that's needed to save humans from a disease like AIDS, but we're corporations now. We only do research and development if we're going to make a profit, so we need to profit from, the AIDS drugs that we sell. And consequently, you ended that, awful situation of not wanting to sell them in Africa because the people didn't have enough money to buy them, and that's what the whole thing was about. Now, of course, there was some social democratic response to that, and it was eventually dismantled. But we saw the same thing again. I forget his name, but again, for that sociopathic young fella who bought the drug patents and then jacked up the prices. That's normal corporate behaviour, and so we've been living in a society dominated by this pseudo-human that has no moral faculty for more than 2 or 3 lifetimes now. And so, a lot of us have begun to sort of think, well, that's the way the world works. And so I think that's, it encourages this hyper-individualism in people. And I remember at Bentley, because Bentley was such an amazing explosion of real communitarianism, but we had this minor problem, of hyper-individualism, of sort of, jumped up young fellas, nobody's going to tell me what to do, and they'd be a bit of a hassle. I found them a bit of a hassle. I locked horns with them occasionally and saying, oh, you're an individual, are you? I'm not, I'm a member of a community, and they'd sort of get upset. People cling to their individualism like it's the most cherished thing they've got. They hold on to it and they'll defend it from anybody. Don't tell me what to do, this is my individual right to choose. And it's like, and there's some importance to that on some level, but the way people cling to it. And I remember we were sitting around the fire at Bentley, and I'd had a bit of it. We go in with some of these young sort of individualist heroes, and so I wanted to say something to the group, so I just sort of said, look, it's sad when I see people clinging to their individualism like it's the most precious asset, because really the most precious things in life are our connectedness. It's our connection to nature, it's our connection to community, it's our connection to each other, within this blockade. And individualism really is just the consolation prize. It's actually the booby prize of all you've got left after you've lost all those connections which are vital and important to you. And that's the sadness of it. And that's the sadness I see in sovereign citizens. It's the sadness I see in conspiracists. It's the sadness I see in extreme libertarians. It's the sadness I see in mask resistors. It's the sadness that I see that's driving this. It's the lack of connection. It's that people, through this neoliberal corporate world, have been so broken down that we don't see ourselves as part of the community. We don't see ourselves as a part of an extended family, part of a tribe, or properly part of nature. And so we're paranoid. We're actually afraid. We're sociopathic because we're so individualistic, and we're paranoid. And it's that paranoia that's driving belief in all sorts of paranoid conspiracy theories and so on. So getting to, what can we do about it? Because that's what I was saying, I don't have any answers on how we prevent Trump getting elected, how we fight rising fascism right at this point. What's going on in the world at the moment is so big, it's so frightening, it's so unpredictable, it's so complex that a lot of us have just got to hold onto our hats and watch it. But how do we do that? And I think, one of the first things we have to do is really focus on staying sane in these times. And how do we stay sane? The answer is staying connected. It's disconnection which is the enemy. Corporations are disconnected. They are disconnected from the planet. They don't have a moral faculty. They don't have families. They don't breathe air. They don't drink water. And yet they're running our society. And a lot of the people around us are falling into that same kind of sociopathy and hyper-individualism as well. And that's a lot of the problem. So, what I really have been encouraging people to focus on is the forms of embodiment that can keep us sane. Because if we share the mentality of this collapsing system, it will be an utterly terrifying ride. If we can step back from the psychosis, because the system we are in is collective psychosis and it is collapsing. If we can step back from that collective psychosis and have a sort of an Archimedean place to stand, we may get hurt by it physically, but which we well can by fascism and poverty and so on, but at least we will be able to maintain a perspective on it and not just be caught in the absolute madness of it. And that's the sadness for many of our people caught in this conspiracy theories. They're getting sucked into the madness of it, as well as whatever impacts it's going to have on them. And how we avoid that? Look, the sun is still sane. The stars are still sane. Possums are still sane. Magpies maybe not, but not this time of year. But animals are still sane. Newborn babies are still sane. Most dogs are, well, a lot of dogs are still sane. Some have been messed up. It's connecting with those things, you know, and our own bodies as well. And that's the other thing, you know, the other thing that's happening, again, through corporate culture and through digital culture, is this incredible disembodiment, this disconnection from our bodies. And when we disconnect from our bodies and we just become minds walking around on legs, we tend towards sociopathy again. We tend towards, you know, disconnected mental activity, which leads to sociopathy, narcissism, and fear and paranoia, and so on again. So, really, the most important things we need to be doing as individuals, yes, we are individuals, let's not be hyper-individuals, and particularly as communities, is all about connection. Because we need to be connecting with other humans who aren't corporations, with other people who have moral faculties, with other people who breathe air and have children and babies and live and die and have bodies and experience fear and experience emotions. The sanity really is the first thing, because the tipping points we're facing at the moment are truly frightening. They are truly threatening, and in a sense, I know in myself, you know, when it looks like, when I consider the climate catastrophe, when I consider the idea of rising fascism, of war, of, you know, millions dying in pandemics, if you only look at that as an individual, you're terrified and you're frightened because you're thinking about your own, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my family, what's, you know, how's it going to be, what's going to happen within my lifetime. But as soon as you do connect, you begin to get a bigger picture where your lifetime starts to become less important, your individual existence starts to become less important, and you start to, you know, be able to go, oh, gee, you know, a lot of humans might die and there might be an age of terrible disruption, but there will also be something that comes after it, and that's what we need to focus on. And so the first step is that sense of getting back to connection, so you're not just collapsing into a sociopathic hyper-individualism. So really, sort of wrapping up now, you know, because I've got to say something positive. You know, what can we do going forward? Well, it is connecting, it's connecting in, and then taking that really bigger view and going, even if it's not right now, even if it's not in my lifetime, but what I need to be working towards again is strengthening mine and our connections with the environment, mine and our connections with nature, with each other, with community, rebuilding family, rebuilding extended family, and then working on, and I've said this at the other talks, you know, not worrying too much about what's the one big political solution that we need to have right now. Those sort of talks, it's actually become too complex and too unpredictable for us to do that. So what we need to be doing instead, once we've grasp some sort of connectivity and some sort of sanity, is to then go back out and sow the millions of seeds of multiple regenerative experiments, whether they're regenerative agriculture, whether they're regenerative structures within our communities, whatever they are. And that's what I've always encouraged people, whatever your activist passion is, to go out and make the world a better place, go out and do it, because we're sowing the many, many, many seeds, and some of those things take off, some of them won't. But I think we're way past the stage where any of us can get enough of a view of it, or, you know, we're past the age where there's one big solution that's going to solve this. The other thing I would say, though, is to value and treasure what we've got left of democratic institutions as well. to not completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. Our trade unions and our civil society sector, our non-government organisations, our social movements, really treasure those things. If we still, while we still have elections, while we still have political parties, find the political parties that don't take the corporate donations, that aren't replicating the corporate will. We know who they are. Starts with G. Try to change. I mean, the Labor Party, that is a democratic institution. It's struggling awfully at the moment. It's having a fight with its, a terrible fight with its own heart. Hopefully it could be rescued. There's no rescuing the Liberal Party. They are just the neoliberal hand servants. So I think, so a few messages really. Stay sane, reconnect with community, don't fall into sociopathic individualism, try to help other people out of that sociopathic individualism, and certainly if we're talking to people who are getting sucked into the conspiracy theories, it's not that helpful to tell them they're wrong. It tends to reinforce everything, but to try and empathise with the feelings behind it. Yes, you feel you're being lied to. You have been lied to. Yes, you feel there's dark forces running things. There are dark forces running things. And yes, you're feeling terrified. Yes, that's because of your individualism. Let's go for a walk in nature. Let's try to reconnect first. Multiple regenerative experiments is always the way. Go out and do all of those things. And yeah, let's not give up yet on what we do have left. It's looking very terrifying in the States in terms of the collapse of their democratic structures. Australia's will be a little bit more robust for some time yet, so let's do what we can with what we've got left. And that's why sometimes people say to me, political parties, what's the point? Now the thing is, there is a point to these institutions because there's two different ways in which major social change happens. One is that you have these great big tipping point moments like revolutions, Arab Springs, collapses of the Soviet Union, where things suddenly change quickly over a week or less, 24 hours. And we may get to those points. And some of them may be ugly and retrograde, and some of them, hopefully, as we go along, will begin to be positive. But then after those big tipping points happen, then you need to bed those changes in. And to bed those changes in, you do need to have some kind of extant structure. One of the analyses I read of the Arab Spring, or the Egypt in particular, they had the big uprising, the big tipping point that got rid of the old regime, but the only people who had the infrastructure for implementing something new was the Muslim Brotherhood, because they did have community infrastructure in place. So we do have to build that community infrastructure at all times, because we can all wait for the big revolution, the big tipping point, the big collapse, whatever, but the rebuilding process will tend to rely on existing networks and existing connections we've built. So that's kind of the final thing. So it's build new ones, build new institutions, build new connections, but in the meantime, let's not throw out the ones we've got. Let's support, if we've got anti-corporate political parties, let's support them. If we've still got elections, let's get involved in them. We've still got a decent judicial system in Australia, let's support it and let's work with it. We've still got a decent health system, let's try and keep that in place, because we're certainly needing that going forward. What we expect is more and more crises. With the climate crisis, the pandemic's probably only the first one. So, we're going to have to go through this in waves and waves and waves. So certainly these lessons about how we stay sane, how we build connection, and then how we maintain the infrastructure for a better future and launch those multiple experiments is what it's all about. That's all I've got.
Wow, that was as great as I hoped it might possibly be. Thank you, Aidan. Liz is going to tell you a little bit briefly before we have the Q&A about our next speaker. But I just can't resist telling you now, in case anyone leaves, that every Sunday at 1 p.m. in Mullumbimby Community Gardens, there is a fantastic meeting going on, about 100, 150 people, with really what we can do. And it's all ages and all types, and I highly recommend. Here's Liz Elliott, Dr. Liz Elliott.
It's
It's so nice to be back in the pub again with all you guys. And it's amazing that the speed of the take-up of this talk shows that Mullen was waiting for it to happen again, so here we are again. But it isn't enough just to come here. We need, obviously we're only a quarter of the numbers we normally have. We need to push it out. We need to, if we're going to have, we've got a Facebook page, thanks to the saintly narrator who's done all our IT work. He's been great. And of course, Michael Borson on video with Sam helping with the live stream that'll go out on the Facebook, and Prattam are just driving and guiding all the way. So it's, and Wayne on sound. So we've got a few of the old crew here and a few new volunteers coming in. So that's great. We also need all of you to get onto Facebook and get onto our website, which is turningpointtalks.com. Is that right? Have I got it right? I'm such a technophobe. Join the mailing list. Please send it out, because Mullen's insights, which I'll sort of grab Aidan and put in that bucket, Mullen, Lismore, Byron. You know, we've got something to help the world with, and the world's looking for solutions, I believe. And you know, obviously this COVID thing is a very serious problem, not the illness, which has in fact killed less than the flu in many ways, the normal winter flu. But what it's done is it's been using it, whilst the population are all tied up in this disease, I might get sick. What's happening is we're progressing towards the Great Reset, which the IMF was talking about 7 years ago, where they say no country, no place will be exempt. All education, health, monetary particularly, and governance systems will be centralised and made unaccountable. It's called the Great Reset. If you don't believe me, look it up. It's huge. The IMF's been pushing it along with all the usual villains, including some of the ones that people are paranoid about. Thanks again, Aidan, for leading us in a wonderful talk. So the next talk is really relevant, and what's more, it's a really relevant date. It's November the 4th. That's the first Wednesday of every month, right? But it just so happens it's the day after the US elections. I don't suppose... Yes, I tried to get Philip Fraser along, but he's busy writing a book, so we're going to have to concentrate that energy on our next speaker, who happens to be American, and not just any American, America's leading financial activist, Ellen Brown. Ellen Hodgson Brown's my personal favourite writer. She's clear. She just explains financial things in a way that makes sense. So she's really worth coming to. Unfortunately, she can't come because of, guess what? And of course, she's very busy. So she's going to pre-record, we're going to have it on Zoom. We hope you guys will come and give us atmosphere and feeling, and what we also hope you'll do is give us some questions. So if you've got some questions about financial matters, and I don't mean how can I get rich, I mean how can we be truly wealthy, which is climate, community and future, please direct them towards myself on Liz at turningpointtalks.com, or the website maybe, or even in person on a piece of paper tonight. We'd like some questions. We'll forward them to her, and she'll be talking about such matters as why the US elections, why the farce that has become Tweedledum versus Tweedledee, really, they're all Wall Street puppets if you ask me. Why are these elections being driven by the financial interests? Why are we getting wars when we need to have cooperation? Why have we got all these business cycles which are totally unnecessary? Why have we got increasing inequality, not just in Australia but all over the world? Why is this? It's mainly because some people make money and most people scrabble to get a little portion of it, and they'll scrabble even over in this terribly competitive, individualistic way that's not only harmful to the environment and, of course, our society, it's incredibly disempowering personally. It's very painful for a lot of people. There's a lot of mental illness. Over 52% of Americans are officially mad. So, I didn't make it up, it's true. It might be more by now. So if you add all the alcoholics, all the dementia people, all the anxious people, that's 27%, all the people who are, you know, clinically obviously mad, depression is just skyrocketing. So it's a hugely painful situation that we're cut off from the land and from each other and from community. We feel alone, and that's a terrifying situation, which, as Aidan has so eloquently said, that leads to some very strange conclusions. Well, anyway, so Ellen Brown, please come along. I know she won't be here in person, but she will be answering our questions. We're going to Zoom it out, and we hope that people will send that on to their friends, because she is so clear. She's such a senior activist. She works so hard. And she runs a thing called the Public Banking Institute in America. Over 13 states are now on the verge of getting a public bank, which will free up massive funds for good things like small business, like ecological repair. So it's a hugely important movement, and it also starts to take power away from the big private banks, which are heading us towards financial collapse. So please come November the 4th. You probably will have to book again. I want to thank again the pub for being so, and Ollie in particular, for being so kind to us. They even excluded their normal patrons. So we're really great to have you. It's fabulous to have Aidan, and please come November the 4th to see Ellen Brown. Thank you. All right, Liz, thanks for that. We're a great team. So I've just been told that those of you who are watching us live on Facebook, it's also possible for you to ask Aidan the questions. So if you'd like to do that, how do they do that? Just type it to you?
Maybe just type it in and I
Just
can ask
type it to Sam here and she will relay it on. And in the meantime, please put your hand up if you have any questions for Aidan. Oh, yes, well, Liz. Any questions? Do you want to bring your chair in the light, or yeah, because you're a bit dark.
Comfy chair.
Yeah.
Maybe Aidan, if you could sit just there halfway between those two objects, I've got a good light in there.
Yes, that's where the light. There you go.
And maybe you can move the audience.
Yes. Do you want another drink?
Yeah, just water.
Just to take it easy, please.
Blah, blah, blah. Is that working? It's got it.
Have you been aware of the cousin history that when they got sick and tired of putting into fascism, they just took matters in their own hands? They had no idea what democracy was. They were just sick and passive. And they made it a different people. Is it not possible that the same thing may happen today? And also, and taking into consideration the new generation, the younger people, and their fight for climate, and what we have seen in the streets of the capital cities of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, I think.
What's the question?
I'm not sure.
Could you clarify the question, perhaps?
Oh, that's all right.
Got it?
It was a bit hard to hit, but I can respond. You know, I think one of the things you're pointing to is the unpredictability of these situations, and also, you know, sometimes people go, "Are things getting better or worse in the world?" They feel like they're getting worse at in 2020, but in general, I often think that things are getting simultaneously better and worse at the same time, which is possible in an expanding universe. And so you're quite right in that we don't know what the emerging generation will bring us, you know, for good or for otherwise, you know, and we don't know, you know, what the particular tipping points we're coming to are. I mean, personally, I've got to confess to being fairly pessimistic at the moment. 2020 sort of has that effect, I think, but I don't believe that I know, and you know, that's one of the disclaimers. You know, I sort of feel in the last few years, you know, I used to struggle to try and have idea of where things were going, but I think it's becoming increasingly impossible. You know, to sort of assess, and particularly how quickly things will change. You know, we can sort of go, gee, it's incredible how quickly America seems to be sliding into fascism. But do we also think that if it does slide into fascism, like you're saying about Italy, that how long will it stay there before it emerges into a new and possibly, you know, renewed and more positive form? We really don't know. which is why I sort of say, you know, perhaps one of the few things we can do at the moment is grab onto our sanity, connect how we can, build what we can, and just be adaptive, because it is so unpredictable.
Hi, Aidan. It was a very interesting talk. I came here thinking, well, I guess it's the definition of conspiracy had me wondering, because where people draw that line of what's a conspiracy and what's not probably changes from person to person, and many people would think of some of the things you don't think of as conspiracies and so on. So it was great to hear you clarify that for us. But I guess what I'd like to ask now is more about the other things that are about to hit us, like the technological singularity and so on, the effect of our technologies are reaching a turning point as well, especially AI, and I imagine that will have a huge effect on the corporate structure and so on. So I'd love you to give us some insights into what you see coming on that level.
One of the things that's just getting the difference between conspiracy and, you know, it's an interesting point you're pointing to there, because I think some people confuse an observation of corruption, you know, because I've seen some people say, oh, well, look at all the conspiracies that have been proven to be true, you know, look at, you know, Contragate and Watergate and things like that, and you're sort of going, no, those weren't conspiracy theories, those were allegations of corruption. And allegations of corruption are based on evidence, aren't provable at the time and are later proved. And I think there is a big difference between an allegation of corruption that isn't yet proven and a conspiracy theory. I mean, particularly for me, the thing that I most see conspiracy theories as involving is this kind of assertion of control sort of by a group. And one of the ways I look at the world is that there's a huge number of vested interests all engaged in what you might call mini conspiracies to advantage themselves. So, you know, Putin's trying to get it going for Russia, and China's trying to get it, and, you know, the Islamic world, and, you know, and the different corporations, and, you know, the fossil fuel industry, big pharma, you know, they all have agendas, they're all trying to advantage themselves, they're all donating to political parties and trying to influence government. The only difference is that they're multiple, and there isn't necessarily one coordinating body. You know, if there was one coordinating body that was capable of running the world, silencing all the scientists, co-opting all of the immunologists, and running the place, the world would probably make a little bit more sense than it does. If we actually had a global elite running it, they'd probably decide not to go down the climate change path, for example. We're kind of going down the climate change path because, in a sense, there's just all these different agendas running in all different directions. And, you know, there's actually a lack of global governance when it comes to something like climate change. Onto your question about technology. One of the things that's worrying me at the moment, and, you know, this is one of the areas where I start to fellow travel with some of the right, really, is this move towards cashlessness. The move towards cashlessness is an extremely dangerous and frightening move. It's being perpetrated by the big banks, and the reason for moving towards cashlessness is partly because in order to get you all in debt to underwrite late capitalism, interest rates, as you've been seeing, have been going down and down and down. And in some places in the world, interest rates are going into negative territory. That's never happened before. It's like with climate change, they stop believing in science, and with negative interest rates, they just stop believing in maths. It's kind of Ponzi scheme capitalism getting to this ridiculous point where it's like we're so desperate for ordinary people to go out and get in debt that we're prepared to do it at negative interest rates. But the problem they have with, because, you know, with the financial system, you know, once upon a time a country had to have enough gold to back the money that it lent out, and banks had to have enough deposits to back the money they lent out. We let go of all that. Banks have been able to just lend you an on-paper $1 million and the only place that $1 million ever comes back from is from you working and paying it back. It didn't exist when they gave it to you. They just underwrote it, and then you had to pay it back. So this idea we're going to give you all easy loans at negative interest rates because we need more consumption to keep the Ponzi scheme of capitalism going, that really is just, we need ordinary people to go into debt in order to underwrite the rest of the pyramid scheme. Otherwise it's going to collapse. Well, it is going to collapse. So debt's a thing that worries me a lot. Cashlessness comes into that because if the banks are going to go to negative interest rates, then there's got to be any sensible reason why we would put savings in the bank, because we won't get any interest. If we could securely bury them under the ground under a negative interest rate scenario, that would be the equivalent of getting interest, because we'd still have as much money left later. So the banks want to move to cashlessness because then we won't be able to store cash. We will be forced to use the banking system, and then they can charge us for using it, which is the negative interest rate. So, you know, the account keeping fee will get much, 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 much bigger once there is no choice but to put money with the bank. In essence, what will happen is that you don't even put money in the bank, the money never goes out of the bank. All that you have is effectively your credit card, which is your identity, and whatever money the system decides you get, your wages, whatever goes in, and when you spend it, it goes out. It's never really yours, it's just in your name in the bank. Now, that's kind of terrifying. Terrifying because I know what governments will do with that. If you look at the way governments have been using your driver's licence, for example, as a way of enforcing the drug laws, I've got to mention it now, and David's left, but I said I couldn't mention it. You know, they pick you, you know, they pick something like your driver's licence. Oh, you know, if we take that away, you're sort of, you know, you're really stuffed, so we'll use that as a criminal penalty. Well, the minute there's no cash, freezing your credit card will be the absolutely most powerful criminal punishment there is, because the minute your credit card gets frozen in a cashless world, you can't do anything. You can't buy a hamburger, you can't get on a bus, you can't get on a train, you can't feed yourself, you can't move, you can't buy petrol, you can't do anything. So, enormous control of people under cashlessness. And then, thirdly, we worry, you know, I remember when I first read about China's social credit system, where everybody had an identity and they were surveilling everybody, and you got a credit rating for how much you were replicating the values of the Chinese Communist Party, and you know, and if you didn't, your credit rating went down and down and down, and you might be prevented from travelling, from getting loans, from getting an education, from leaving the country. And you sort of look at what's going on with us. Instead of having a state-sponsored surveillance system, we've got a corporate surveillance system. Our credit card is that corporate surveillance system because it records every single thing. Unless we've got cash, it records every single thing we buy. You take cash away, every single thing you buy and every single location you are in to buy something will be on that Akashic record that the banks are holding. And more than that, of course, instead of us being under, you know, it's, and this gets back to what I was talking about tonight about corporations. You know, the Liberals worried so much about the individual and the state, you know, surveilling the individual and taking away the individual's privacy and oppressing the individual. And yet, you now look at the, you know, the amount of information harvested from us, from our mobile phones, from our internet searches, from Siri listening to our conversations with each other and then sending us an advertisement about the fact that we just, you know, oh, I'm thinking of buying a new trailer. Bang, here's an ad for trailers, you know. So we're under an incredible surveillance state, but it's actually a privatised surveillance state. It's Google and Amazon and all of those. So cashlessness is one of the ones, because I was talking about, you know, how do we resist this? It's through embodiment, connection to the real world. Well, you know, as problematic as cash has always been, it is a form of embodiment. You know, it's a physical manifestation of some value which you could put in a pocket or stick in an ammunition tin under the ground and pull out and trade with another real living human being without anybody knowing about it. And so we lose that, we really do lose so much. It will complete the corporate privatised surveillance state in which we are all cast, as I was saying, as one of the 4 types of humans that corporations are interested in, consumers. Managers, workers, consumers, and the superfluous. And the superfluous is the people who aren't managers or workers, so they don't have any money, they can't consume, so we may as well just let them die en masse, which is pretty much how corporations look at it. So yeah, there's some of the problems. Then when it comes to AI, again, we're not being paranoid if we're worried about AI. I like to say to people, corporations are the early form of AI. They were built in the human image, or the selfish, acquisitive human image, and they've risen to become dominant governance institutions. But the more AI we develop and hand to corporations, the more problematic that's going to get. Because when I think AI, I think sociopathy. Because I just really believe that our moral faculty, our ethical ability, our humility, it comes from our mortality. The fact that we die, the fact that we suffer, the fact that we have children, the fact that we feel love, the fact that we breathe air, and the fact that we share our actual DNA with everything else on this planet. That's where our real connectivity comes from. And when we start creating artificial people in the form of corporations and then giving them artificial intelligence, it will all be sociopathic. So, I'm not an expert on technology, really just more looking at it from this perspective of sort of going, it all just tends towards sociopathy and tends towards us really being outed on our own planet. That's the picture I'm trying to paint for people with that thing about just stop for a moment and look at it from the corporation's perspective and look down on a planet that's got these things called humans, and you've just got to rearrange them into managers, workers, consumers and superfluous. So yeah, there's a few answers. I mean, I don't have any answers, that's for sure, but I've certainly got responses.
Hello, my name's Susan, and I have a question relating, I think, specifically to the Northern Rivers, because I think, is it on?
Just put it a bit closer to your mouth.
Okay, no, it's not on there. That's better. Susan is my name. I have a question relating to creativity and the Northern Rivers in particular. I think most people would regard the Northern Rivers as a fairly creative area. I only caught half of the budget speech last night, and I don't think I needed to catch much more, but I didn't hear creativity mentioned at all, and tonight, as you spoke, I didn't hear creativity. I wonder if you have some feelings about, or some thoughts about, the role of creativity, the role of arts and fear in our community and our future, and the Northern Rivers in particular. Where does creativity fit, and how important is it?
I don't know. You're probably right, it's probably not really my area, not really being sort of an artist or musician myself, but certainly it's essential to being human, and I think it brings us back to that stuff I was talking about. Well, what is it to be human? What is it to be embodied? What is it to be a natural person, rather than one of those sort of disembodied sociopathic entities? And I think that humans will always have celebration, humans will always have creativity, art, music, we generate that for ourselves, amongst ourselves. The fact that we've seen it downgraded and downgraded and downgraded is a reflection of that neoliberal dismal tide I was talking about, of looking at everything in a disembodied sociopathic way, treating everything as a commodity and going, we don't need those things if they don't have a dollar value. And so consequently, we value, technology has enabled us to have, mega global superstars who sell a lot of things, which has made life more difficult for your village musician. And you're right, the Northern Rivers is great because we have plenty of those, and we really sort of pursue that sort of thing. Because we are everything I was talking about in the talk. We are a community. We do have, incredibly well-developed infrastructure as a community. That's why we can pull off something like the Bentley blockade. That's why we could pull off like Dismal Helping Hands, you know, after the flood hit. You know, we have this incredibly beautiful, dense, soft infrastructure as a community, which really is person to person, and it is based, you know, on the planet, and we have a, you know, a thriving, you know, art and music culture. But you're right, globally, nationally, in the public sphere, that's been degraded and degraded and degraded again by this, you know, sociopathic corporate neoliberal culture.
Aidan, thank you. Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez in New York, has proved the connectivity theory that you've been talking about by getting not 1 cent from corporate donations, but only the local people, the $2, the $20 or whatever. And I'm just wondering what you think of her thought of the new Green Deal of taxing people on a scale even up to 90% once you get past an income of $10 million a year.
Well, I mean, she's one of the absolute bright spots, really, isn't she? She's fantastic, and you know, and that's the sort of thing that, you know, gives us a bit of hope, as like the climate strikes and, you know, the school strikes and so on. And you know, I suppose it's important to have a look at those things. And the Green New Deal has, I mean, it is the obvious, rational, achievable approach, and it's good to see the Greens in Australia taking it up as well. And it's sort of tragic, sort of sitting looking at this whole, you know, COVID recovery package nonsense that's being given to us by this government, and it has no creativity. It has, like I said before, there's almost nothing but corruption in it. There was a Wilcox cartoon that had, you know, the COVID recovery working group that the federal government set up, and one had the head of an oil well, and one had the head of a fracking donkey, and the other one had the head of, you know, a mining truck or something, and, you know, and now we're going to work up a new ideas. So, but yeah, she's fantastic, you know, and that's what we're looking for: connectivity and the multiple experiments. I mean, it's, you know, it's great to have, I mean, it's wonderful to have that model there that people can work towards. And that's what I sort of mean about, let's not, you know, in all the despondency and all the dismal tide, let's not let go of what we've got left of democratic infrastructure, of good political parties, or the occasional good politician, or any of those things, because there might be, we're going to have a series of shocks, a series of collapses, and there might be a time for rebuilding in which there is a massive thirst for an answer. I mean, the example I always use for the importance of launching multiple regenerative experiments at all times is solar power. You know, in the 70s, solar power was just something that weird off-the-grid hippies were playing with for their own purposes. But because they were playing with it, and they developed it and developed it and developed it, suddenly when we realised the carbon catastrophe and went, gee, what are we going to do for power? Here was this, one of the multiple regenerative experiments that had been happening all along was suddenly there, ready to be taken up. And that's where, yeah, things like that, Green New Deals, those kind of thinking, regenerative agriculture and all those things, even though we're working on them and don't feel like we're getting anywhere, the fact that they're there, ready to just suddenly pop up at a time in history when suddenly there is an openness to it, because, yeah, it is unpredictable, we don't know. We might clear fell things so badly, it might be like a forest fire that happens to our society, that it's so clear fell that new shoots can just emerge all over the place. So putting that energy into imagining those new shoots is absolutely essential, and that's where I really encourage a diversity of that, because we never really know which one is going to be the one that takes off opportunistically at the time. But that's beautiful in a way too, because it kind of validates what we all do as activists and experimenters, to say, oh, well, you know, you go out and work on your permaculture, and you go out and work on your waste management projects, and, you know, you go out and work on solar power, because all of these things are currently useful anyway, and they might turn out to be incredibly useful after a major disruptive event.
Could you just say
something to his question about tax. Wasn't that part of the question?
Oh, I like tax.
Yeah.
Tax is good, yes. We should have more of it, definitely. I mean, you know, I've got the job at the university, so there's enough of an income that whenever ScoMo does a tax cut, I get a tax cut, and I just hate it. You know, they did another one last night, and it's like, I don't want a tax cut, I want a fair society. You know, way more than I want a tax cut, I want a fair society. A little story about that: I was living in Vanuatu, which is actually a tax haven. There was no income tax, and I was at the time in a family of 5, and you know, it was very, very expensive having our evacuation insurance and our medical insurance and sending the kids to school and all these things. And I was applying for a job at a university back in Australia, you know, and I looked at the wage, whatever it was, $90,000 or something, and I thought, oh, how much tax would I be paying on that? And I looked it up, and it was $23,000. And it was a job in Darwin, I think. And I remember just from having lived in a tax haven for 5 years where the government was just broke and couldn't do much, thinking, well, what would I get for $23,000 in Australia? And you'd go, for a family of 5, you'd get really, really good free medical care for the entire family, free education for the entire family, you know, roads, you know, everything, you know, judicial system, roads, boat ramps, air sea rescue, you know, it goes on and on and on, and you just look at it, and honestly, from a purely financial perspective, you know, I just looked at it and went, that is the best $23,000 you could ever spend. You could never, it mounts up, you educate 3 kids and do hospital for a family of 5 in a year, it gets to $23,000 in no time. And that's with all of the wastage on politicians' wages and overseas trips and military and everything. That $23,000 is still well spent. So yes, I hate those tax cuts. Every time there's a tax cut, because all it is every tax cut is just an excuse to cut services down the line. It's the time bomb that the Liberals keep setting, and it's a time bomb they set for future Labor governments. They go, well, we'll cut taxes now so that next time Labor gets in, there won't be any money to spend. They do it on purpose. That's the neoliberal thing. So yeah, tax cuts are the evil.
Well, in modern monetary theory, money can come out of thin air, as we see with all the marvellous, you know, largesse of the government for COVID, not for the environment, but for COVID. We could manage to pay everybody heaps of money. So modern monetary theory says we can create money out of thin air, for sure, the government, but you need tax, because otherwise the rich just control the government. You'd actually need tax mainly as to control the out of control, very, very wealthy, and that's not happening.
I guess so. And look, I'm not sure whether we can create money out of thin air, but to the extent that we are creating money out of thin air, it would make sense if we spend it on real, genuine nation-building things, rather than on giving it to Rupert Murdoch and the fossil fuel industry. I mean, we're spending it on suicidal things at the moment. I mean, I think it's true. I think a government could produce, to an extent, money out of thin air, provided they said, well, let's build social housing with this, for example. And of course you'll be more wealthy afterwards. Yeah.
Another question? Anything? Asking to go around?
And this is more a conversation because I don't really have answers to any of these things. I don't really know much about technology or financial systems or any of that.
We come to Ellen Brown next time.
I've got a bit of a sensitive question.
Oh.
So, you talk about corporate surveillance and social grading and AI and cashless society, and we see a dehumanization of humanity, basically, and we become human resources, da da da. Since the beginning of COVID, there have been talks about vaccinating every human on the planet, and medical passport, COVID passport, and for the highest good of all, of course. What's your take on this?
On vaccination?
Yeah. In the context, in this context.
Well, I mean, it's not one of my areas of expertise, that's for sure. You know, medicine and immunology and vaccination isn't one of my areas of expertise. My only personal involvement with it really was when I was a father of young babies and had to, you know, personally with the with their mother obviously, make decisions about whether and when and what to vaccinate for. And what I ended up, and we looked into it, investigated it to some extent, and ended up coming to the view that there were risks to the individual in vaccination, and there were benefits to the society in vaccinating, and that it wasn't easy to make a call between those two. And that's sort of where I went to, sort of looking at it. Well, at the public health level, the arguments in favour of it are fairly good, but that's not going to help any one individual who might have an adverse reaction. And so it was a matter of having to make, our own decision in that respect. And I remember at the time, we weren't keen on vaccinating the newborn baby for whooping cough, because of the risk of adverse effects, but we also realised that if we were going to make that decision, then we wouldn't be putting that baby into childcare until it was a certain age, and so so that there was a reciprocal obligation about, well, if we take this individualistic approach that we're worried about the individual effects over the social obligation, well then we're going to have to take the social obligation of putting in that extra care and that extra isolation during that period. We can't have it both ways. So we did that, and she didn't get whooping cough until after she was 2 or something, and but eventually we went on and vaccinated for most of the other things because we went overseas and so on. But this isn't my area of expertise. The only thing I've got to respond to that question is, as I said, just my own personal experience of weighing it up and really seeing, well, there's a bit of an unanswerable question sometimes between the individual risks and the social benefits, and you just have to weigh that up. But if you do take the view that I'm going to make the individual decision rather than the social, I think you've still got a social responsibility.
Sorry, what I found is that the excuse of the highest good of all and the community, the social being, also brings technology like social grading. Social grading is something that's apparently for the highest good of all, but really it's killing individuals. Social grading, like in China when we mix with AI and what I'm saying is that sometimes this argument of like the highest good of all is used against the people in a very tyrannical way. What I'm worrying is that it's going to happen with the vaccine as well. And it's big money. Anyway, I'm not sure I was heading.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. I mean, utilitarianism is a theory, justified everything if it brought the greatest good to the greatest number, but it was a terribly dangerous philosophy really for minorities for that reason. So it's true, you can't go all the way with the greatest good for the greatest number, but that's where I sort of talk about communitarianism, because the dichotomy that we get familiarly given is state control versus individual liberty. That's the narrative of liberalism all of the time, and the two things that get lost out of that is corporations, which kind of disappear and aren't part of that dichotomy, and community. So when I talk about communitarianism, it's not just state control. Communitarianism is far more where you are, running, locating political power in communities. And so it's not individualistic, but it is about looking after the whole of community in localised ways as well. And it needs to exist as a counterpoint, really. You've got individualism and state power and corporate power. I think community is that most essential counterpoint to those other three types of power, really. There isn't necessarily an easy question to vaccination. That's what I found when I was a new parent and looked right into it. it was a weighing up of both a community responsibility and an individual concern. Beyond that, I don't know. You done? All right, well, there's a whole lot of things I'm not expert on.
Looks like you've got your work cut out, answering all those other questions. Thanks very much, everyone. I hope everyone got their question in that they wanted to ask then. It's great to be back in the courthouse pub. I hope we can all be many more people soon. And Aidan, I thought you just covered everything. I really found that extremely stimulating. I think maybe everyone here felt that was pretty riveting, huh? Yes. Let's have another, yeah. So maybe you could let us know if you're giving any talks somewhere else in this moors not so far away, that we could come and follow you some more. I'd like to anyway. So thanks everyone. Please come back and pass it on the first Wednesday in every month.